Dobar vam dan i dobrodošli u još jednu emisiju u kojoj ćemo govoriti sa jednim vrlo zanimljivim gostom. Sumantra Bose indijski je profesor međunarodne i komparativne politike na Visokoj londonskoj školi ekonomije. Specijalizirao se za proučavanje etničkih i nacionalnih sukoba i njihovo upravljanje, s posebnim naglaskom na indijski podkontinent, ali i bivšu Jugoslaviju. Ovoga proljeća sudjelovao je na znanstvenom skupu u Neumu posvećenom federalizmu i izbornim reformama u Bosni i Hercegovini. Golemo je zadovoljstvo što je gospodin Bose s nama u Mostaru, gdje je održao predavanje studentima. Dear Professor Bose, first of all, let me thank you to be our guest and welcome here in Mostar.
It's wonderful to be back in Mostar. It's my first time back in 7 years. The last time I came was 2014. But between 1998 and 2004, I was repeatedly and frequently in Mostar and spent a lot of time here.
Let me start not with the federalism. And how do you feel? Do you feel any differences here in Mostar? Did Mostar improve himself, or it's maybe the same situation a couple of years ago when you came here?
Well, since I first came here almost 25 years ago, I remember a completely devastated and disturbed environment. And of course, over the years, there has been change, at least at the superficial level. And I've only been here for 3 days so far on this visit. I'm staying for another several days because I wanted to spend a full week here, just in Mostar. But I notice that the political and psychological divide is still as alive as ever. And it's of course reflected in the urban geography. As it has been since the end of the fighting here in 1994. But at the same time, I'm happy that there is once again a functioning city government after a long gap. And I can also sense an atmosphere of relative optimism here. And I was just interacting with students at the University of Mostar, and I told them that I am counting on their generation to take their city and indeed this country and the whole region forward in the future.
Did they maybe ask you some hard question that you didn't know the answer? I mean, the students.
Yes, they asked various questions. They asked me what I think of the office of the High Representative. They asked me what I think of the flare-up in Montenegro, the flare-up on the Serbia-Kosovo border, and all of that. And one postgraduate student even asked me whether I thought that the political culture here, which has been entrenched in an authoritarian fashion for decades, before the war, is a problem. So I had a lot of very intelligent and thoughtful questions from the students at the University of Mostar.
Let's see if the questions from Večernji list are harder or maybe easier for you. 2.5 decades after the war, the international community in Bosnia and Herzegovina and with domestic communities, nations, not able to build a minimum common statehood and functional institutions together. It seems as if they are continuing the war after the war. Why is that so?
There's a lot of blame to go around. And I don't want to do an exercise in blame gaming. One of the questions that the students asked me just a little while ago was about the political class or the political establishment here, which of course operates entrenched structures of power, is a big part of the authoritarian legacy, and we all know the limitations and indeed often the finality of the political establishment in Bosnia-Herzegovina. So that's no surprise to anyone. However, I think that the quote-unquote international community also has to take a large share of the blame for what has gone wrong in Bosnia-Herzegovina, especially in the last 10 or so years, when Bosnia-Herzegovina's European path has all but stalled. I think that there have been serious errors of strategy of the international community almost from the beginning, from the period right after the end of the war. But these serious errors of strategy have been grounded in faulty normative assumptions. And yesterday I was speaking to a group of academics at the University of Mostar, and I said that there are two major errors, cardinal errors as I called them, grounded in faulty normative assumptions or simply ignorance of the history, the context, and the realities of Mostar and of Bosnia-Herzegovina. The first was the search for non-nationalists as partners or collaborators in the international project of state building. Now, unfortunately, this was always a wild goose chase. This was a red herring, because in Bosnia-Herzegovina, non-nationalists, either they don't exist at all, or they are too weak and marginal to make a difference. Of course, there are some who claim to be above nationalism, but they represent a particular type or form of nationalism while claiming to not do so. And the second cardinal error, which I highlighted to the academics at the University of Mostar, and I think they agreed with me, was this predisposition to the conventional majoritarian form of government, and towards and a preoccupation with building a unitary sense of Bosnian identity, which was always doomed to fail. The Austro-Hungarians failed 100 plus years ago. King Alexander's dictatorship failed to create a unitary pan-Yugoslav identity in the 1930s. So these were the two cardinal errors, grounded
even maybe in
faulty
Tito's time.
Normative.
That was the
yes. Well, of course, Yugoslavism was a supranational concept which accommodated the national identities.
With the republics
yes, I mean, there are many faults in the Titoist system, which was at the end of the day just intended to shore up the authoritarian, one-party rule. But it's important to remember that although the Yugoslav supranational category was available for self-identification, the highest proportion of the population that chose it during the communist Yugoslavia was in the 1981 census, when it was 5%, and then it came down to 3% in the last Yugoslav census of 1991. Of course, in Mostar it was different, where almost 20% of the population chose Yugoslav as their primary identity, but that was an exception.
Dear Professor, in one of your lectures to students, you pointed out that cooperation and integration have failed over time in Bosnia and Herzegovina. To what extent has international interventionalism and the choice of state-building process exhausted their possibilities and, in fact, became part of the problem?
Well, integration and cooperation are two different things. The entire project of international state-building in Bosnia-Herzegovina was directed at integration, which was never going to succeed. given the history, the context, and the realities of Bosnia-Herzegovina, and perhaps the sharpest of all, right here in Mostar. But what I have been arguing for the last 2 decades, including in my best-known work on Bosnia-Herzegovina, my book Bosnia After Dayton, Nationalist Partition and International Intervention, which came out in 2002, is that a much more intelligent international community approach would have emphasized not integration, not the creation of some melting pot out of these conflicting identities, but cooperation, constructive cooperation in the shared interest across the dividing lines. Because the dividing lines are not going to disappear, they will remain. But a much more intelligent international community approach would have emphasized not integration by dissolving these identities or by reducing their salience at least, but constructive cooperation in the shared interest across the dividing lines. And because the international emphasis was flawed from the outset and failed to make a course correction and became, in fact, over time, more and more disposed towards the integrative approach or the integrationist approach, rather than the cooperation across the dividing lines, centered approach, which would have been much more intelligent. Yes, the international community became a big part of the problem.
Well, influential part of the international community persistently advocates solution primarily of unitarism and simple majority rule that would suit Bosniaks as the most numerous community. What are the possible consequences of this approach?
Such an approach is not in the interests of Bosnia-Herzegovina as a whole and of its future, including its inevitable future, sometime down the road as a member state of the European Union. Well, Europe contains, many different kinds of polities. Germany itself is a federal polity, while France is a unitary and fairly centralized state. There is Belgium, which has 2 regions plus a capital region and 3 linguistic communities. We have another European country, Switzerland, which is based on a system of cantons and of shared rule at the political center. In 2004, there was a referendum on a comprehensive settlement of the Cyprus question. And the referendum needed to pass in both the jurisdictions, the so-called Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus and in the Republic of Cyprus, which is the Greek Cypriot-controlled part of Cyprus. And the referendum on a confederal and consociational power-sharing settlement based on 2 constituent states, under an umbrella framework, very much like Bosnia-Herzegovina, was passed by the Turkish Cypriots, but was rejected resoundingly by the Greek Cypriots. Now, just before that referendum, the EU made it clear that if the referendum passed in both jurisdictions, and so this confederal and power-sharing settlement with 2 constituent states, ethno-nationally defined, a Greek Cypriot constituent state across about 2/3 of the country and a Turkish Cypriot constituent state, self-governing, very much like the entity system here, came into being, then the European Union would adjust its rules and regulations to accommodate Cyprus. So if that could be done, it didn't eventually happen, but if that could be done, then why should an exception be made of Bosnia-Herzegovina? The European Union contains, many different kinds of polities, and it should be that way. But in response to your question, I would like to say that, of course, a majoritarian and unitary approach is unacceptable to most Bosnian Serbs and most Bosnian Croats as well, so that's about half the population in all, and 2 of the 3 constituent nations. But I believe that this approach is not in the interest of the Bosniaks either.
Why are you telling so?
Because it's not going to happen. What has happened over the last 20 or more years is that unrealistic expectations have been raised among Bosniaks by this international community approach, which is premised on some form of unitary Bosnian identity and a relatively majoritarian political structure, but those expectations haven't materialized over the last 20 or 25 years. So these have been false expectations and have led to nothing but resistance from the Bosnian Serbs and the Bosnian Croats, and nothing but frustration among the Bosniaks. So this is a dead end. It's not going to go anywhere. And a much more constructive approach would be for the representatives of the 3 communities, with minimal international interference, to sit down and to negotiate the terms of a more functional state, which is explicitly multinational and explicitly federal.
And you mentioned some of the examples, Belgium, Switzerland, but you also mentioned Cyprus, maybe as a role model for Bosnia and Herzegovina. What do you think, what could be ideal for Bosnia and Herzegovina to move forward? In terms to redefine this position in Bosnia and Herzegovina?
Well, the entire Dayton structure is built on collective ethno-national rights and autonomy, although in a very uneven, asymmetric and partial way. So, for example, it's been a source of frustration to many Bosnian Croats that the Bosnian Serbs have their own self-governing entity, but the Bosnian Croats do not. Now, as we all know, it's easier said than done to change the Dayton structure in any way, because that has to be done by consensus, if at all. But I think that a lesser role for the international community, because as we discussed already, a very extensive and intrusive international community role has in fact not been able to realize its objectives, and arguably has done more harm than good to Bosnia-Herzegovina's post-war progress. So I think a reduced international footprint and influence is a good thing. The other result of a very extensive and intrusive international presence and activity, of course, has been that it creates a dependency syndrome, because the political establishment doesn't have to take responsibility.
They have always alibi to do nothing.
To do nothing, yes, because the ultimate authority lies somewhere else. So they are able to free ride on the internationals. So a reduced international role, in fact, puts a greater onus on the political establishment to step up and take responsibility for their own country's future.
Well, the Court of Human Rights has issued 5 judgments against Bosnia and Herzegovina because the representative of minorities who are called others in our country cannot run for the highest position in the state, the presidency and the House of Peoples. Some politicians see this as a way to abolish consensualism, a category of constituent peoples. Are the collective rights of the constituent peoples and individual civil rights mutually exclusive?
Given the history, the context, and the social and political realities of Bosnia-Herzegovina, the political system has privileged collective ethno-national rights and identity. Because seriously, there is no alternative, to that, given the history, the background, the legacies, the context, and the post-war realities. But we are going back to this tussle between individual rights of citizens versus collective rights of national communities. And it is not an either-or choice, as some people very simplistically think, including in the high echelons of the international community, that it either has to be the primacy of individual rights or the primacy of collective ethno-national rights. In fact, if you look at most polities in the world, most countries in the world, most of them combine in some variant the rights of individual citizens and the rights of communities. And given the particular context of Bosnia-Herzegovina and the larger region that it is part of, there is no alternative but to having a political system which gives a lot of weight to collective ethno-national rights and autonomy. But that need not be at the cost of the individual rights of citizens. The problem is that the misplaced priorities of the international community have led to Bosnia-Herzegovina's progress stalling over time. So in fact, the international community has not been able to advance the cause of individual rights of citizens, despite its rhetoric and its best efforts. And I think that with a reduced international footprint and presence with minimal external interference, it's up to the Bosnians themselves, of all three nations, to come up with that kind of reform that will lead to a better balance between collective ethno-national rights and the individual rights of citizens. But this has to be done as an internal process, not something that is externally imposed or engineered.
Let me quote you what you just said a couple months ago in a Neum. If there are three nations, is it logical that there should be three entities, not two entities? Please explain that and why, in your opinion, this is not the case in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Well, the asymmetric and uneven Dayton structure is a result of wartime, exigencies, and of course, the Federation of Bosnia-Herzegovina originated in the ceasefire of March 1994 and was then incorporated into the Dayton Peace Agreement. So this led to the asymmetric situation of three recognized national peoples who are constitutionally equal, but two entities, rather than three. And of course, once the Dayton Agreement was signed, it's proved almost impossible to make any major changes to it. But what I said at the Neum conference, which I joined virtually online from India back in March 2021, is that logically, yes, I can see a basis for the angst among a lot of Bosnia-Herzegovina Croats, that they don't feel, although they are constitutionally an equal people, they don't feel entirely equal if, unlike the Bosnian Serbs, they don't have their own entity. So I can see that they have a point. But I think it would not be very constructive to go on in a wallowing in frustration about this. And of course,
it's maybe the same situation with the intention of some part of the international community to maybe be an advocate for Bosnia to have a unitary state.
Yes, the Federation of Bosnia-Herzegovina is actually not liked by either Bosniaks or Croats. Both sides, for different reasons, see it as superfluous and an imposition and accidental byproduct of the war. But of course, Bosniaks at the end of the day oppose, getting rid of the federation because they think that would give the Croats, what they want. So we are stuck with this unsatisfactory situation. But I can see the logic of the Bosnian Croat position, that they don't feel a fully equal people because they don't have their own entity.
Regarding the implementation of the judgment of the Court of Human Rights on the equality of citizens, wouldn't federation with 3 civil entities fulfill this possibility by reducing constitutional elements at the central government level?
So the RS would become, one of the 3 quote-unquote civil entities, and the various cantons of the federation would become part of one or the other of the 2.
Maybe 1, 2, 3 entity or cantons, and to maybe remove the ethnicity in the constitution and to have election that most of the Croats, most of the Bosniaks and most of the Serbs are electing their representatives. Not to be a Croat, Serb or Bosniak, they can elect anyone they want, but they have legitimacy to elect their own representative, I mean collective representative.
This needs much more study and elaboration, but it could be a path to becoming a quote-unquote more normal federal state, rather than this unwieldy multi-layered arrangement that is the legacy of Dayton. If I'm understanding you correctly, you're suggesting kind of 3 perhaps
3 electoral units, let's say, yes. Just like that.
One being a Bosniak majority.
Yes, with Bosniak, other with
area.
Croatian.
One is a Croat majority area, and the third, of course, is the Serb majority area. It needs more study and elaboration, but that could be a possible way forward. It would require consensus. For example, would the RS agree to do away with its title of Republika Srpska? I don't know. I'm not so sure of that. What's clear is that reform of the Dayton system is overdue, but it has to come from within. And it cannot, otherwise it would have happened by now, cannot and also should not be internationally imposed. And Bosnians themselves need to have a much more active stake in what goes on. Of course, there's a particular issue which has kind of bedeviled Bosnia-Herzegovina because of the loophole where the Croat member of the tripartite presidency has been repeatedly elected on the basis of Bosniak votes. Now, that sort of loophole makes no sense to me. And it should have been closed, long ago with some sort of an amendment. But look at how difficult, impossible in fact, it has proved to change that, to close that loophole, to make sure that the Croat member of the tripartite presidency is elected primarily by the votes of fellow Croats, just as the Serb member is elected mainly by the votes of fellow Serbs and the Bosniak member by the votes of Bosniak citizens. But if something like that has proved so difficult, almost impossible to change, a kind of root and branch, reform of the system seems rather daunting. My own sense is twofold. That first, the rationalization of the Dayton system should not be too ambitious, because that may create, more problems and complications. That it should be a process of rationalization rather than root and branch reform to expedite Bosnia-Herzegovina's path eventually to the European Union. And secondly, the international role, something I've stressed, should not be overweening and intrusive. It should primarily be a Bosnian initiative with minimal international interference.
You recalled this, the Yugoslavia, and in the former Yugoslavia, mostly foreigners called Bosnia and Herzegovina small Yugoslavia.
Microcosm of Yugoslavia.
Microcosm of Yugoslavia. Maybe, do you see a threat for Bosnia and Herzegovina to end just like Yugoslavia because of these unsolving problems for a couple of decades?
It's possible because Bosnia and Herzegovina is a very, very loosely structured umbrella state, and the parts are greater than the whole. There is a point of view, which may or may not be correct, that the Dayton state has either to move towards a more normal kind of multinational federal prototype, or it can dissolve entirely. So the second outcome can't entirely be ruled out, although not in the immediate future. But I do think a much better outcome would be a modus vivendi, as they say in Latin, a pragmatic pact between the three national communities to establish a more workable, explicitly multinational and explicitly federal state. Well, I do recall the years immediately after the end of the war, when so many Bosnian Serbs, as well as many Bosnian Croats, did not even want to say Bosnia-Herzegovina. You know, they said Herceg Bosna or, you know, Republika Srpska, you know, that's it.
In particular here in Herzegovina,
yes.
We want to call us as a Herzegovinians.
Yes, yeah, I mean, the Herzegovinian identity is very, very strong here, and cutting across the ethno-national divide. And that can be a basis of cooperation, in fact, because, well, this side of Mostar is Herzegovinian, the other side is also Herzegovinian. And the context here is quite different from Sarajevo, which is only 2 hours away, but quite far away in other respects. And so I think both the change I do see is that both Bosnian Croats, and despite the rhetoric of Dodik, you know, about secession and the final dissolution of Bosnia and Herzegovina, both Bosnian Croats and Bosnian Serbs have sort of moved beyond the rejectionism, which is a negative stance, basically a defensive negative stance of the early years after the war, the first decade after the end of the war, and they have realized that they have a legitimate stake in Bosnia-Herzegovina. The question is, what type of state is it going to be? They no longer really overwhelmingly reject that a state itself should exist. So, optimistically speaking, the potential does exist for a modus vivendi. But the international community has to learn from some of the strategic mistakes it has made and stop pushing, you know, failed ideas and agendas that were grounded in faulty normative assumptions and in inadequate, or in some cases incorrect understanding, you know, ignorance of the history, the context, and the realities here. You know, I'm visiting Mostar after 7 years, as I mentioned.
Do you maybe see Mostar as an example or maybe a blueprint for the resolution all these problems we are speaking about?
Mostar is the most difficult place in Bosnia-Herzegovina and has been since the end of the war in terms of cooperation. And clearly, jedan grad hasn't worked, you know, based on this unitarist conception and this preoccupation with integration. A much more intelligent approach is encouraging cooperation across dividing lines. And if that materializes in Mostar, which is a very difficult place, it's a very tough place, then it can certainly happen in Bosnia-Herzegovina as a whole. You mentioned a few minutes ago that Bosnia-Herzegovina was a microcosm of Yugoslavia, which of course it was. I mean, there's a saying that without Bosnia there is no Yugoslavia, and without Yugoslavia there is no Bosnia. Unfortunately, that proved to be correct. And likewise, Mostar and its problems and challenges is a microcosm of Bosnia-Herzegovina as a whole. In Mostar, I find that unlike, say, 20 years ago, or even 15 years ago, a lot of the Croat population here have rediscovered their stake in Bosnia-Herzegovina. But of course, they want honorable terms. They want to negotiate their own stake, and I completely understand and respect that.
The final question, BIH is a kind of international experiment. Do you see the maybe solution, this country not to be hopeless, for the young people to stay here and see their own future?
Emigration began in 1992, once the war broke out. It continued through the war, and perhaps it even accelerated in the post-war period because of economic circumstances more than anything else, and other post-war problems. Now, this could not be stopped. You can't really prevent people from leaving if they see no prospects there. And of course, the depopulation of Bihar, is a demographic fact. The first to leave were the professional elite, specialists in various fields, the highly educated. A lot of young people have also left. And is that irreversible? It probably is. So one of the points I made to the students and the academics at the University of Mostar as well is that ways should be found for this huge emigre population post-1992 who have often made very good lives and careers in countries around the world to contribute in a more systematic and organized way, because overwhelmingly they care about Bosnia-Herzegovina, even though they don't live here anymore. And the other thing that I'm counting on is a generational change, that post-war generation has now grown up without a lot of the baggage, of the war. And not everybody has left. Not everybody wants to leave in the younger generation. And even if they leave for higher studies abroad, they want to come back and contribute to their country. I know many people like that as well. And I'm hoping for a much more enlightened, younger generation who will be informed by the mistakes of the past made by the previous generations, especially in the war period. And they will have a much more cosmopolitan, outward-looking orientation. A student was just asking me before I came to do this interview with you that he feels, very Croatian. Okay, he's a Bosnian Croat, but he feels very Croat. And I said, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. There's nothing peculiar or abnormal about it. Most people around the world have a strong attachment and pride in their national identity. I do too. As long as that identity doesn't become a basis of enmity, especially towards your neighbors. It's completely fine to have a proud, sense of national identity, as long as it is not channeled to enmity, but towards constructive cooperation and towards the common good. This is a great fallacy of the international community to see national identities as a problem. I think national identities, strong, proud national identities, are first of all normal, and they are part of the solution. They are not.
And I think also the fundamental stone.
They are the building block, of everything else. One needs to respect and accept these national identities and help to channel them in positive and constructive directions, rather than perpetual division and enmity.
Dear Professor, while we are speaking, I imagine you as a high representative of Bosnia and Herzegovina, or just member of the tripartite member of the presidency of BIH?
The last thing I would want is to become the high representative.
Maybe because of the salary.
Yeah, even if I could. I gave an interview to the BBC Serbian service just a couple of months ago, in fact. And in it I said that it is overdue for the Office of the High Representative in its established form to be kind of terminated and perhaps replaced by something else. And it should have happened, more than 10 years ago already. But I would like to say that, I've been coming to Bosnia-Herzegovina for almost 25 years now. And I consider myself a friend and a well-wisher of the country and all its peoples without any discrimination. And there's a lot to be frustrated about. There's a lot to be disappointed about, especially the economic situation, which we haven't really discussed. But I think it's also possible, amidst all the frustration and disappointment that has accumulated over 25 years, to be cautiously optimistic about the future. But it's very important both for the internationals, especially for the internationals, but also for the locals, the political establishment and the public at large, to learn from the mistakes of the past.
Thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
It was a really pleasure to have you here in Mostar.
Thank you so much. I look forward to coming back very frequently from now on.
Thank you again. Poštovani gledatelji, hvala lijepa za vašu pozornost. Bio je to profesor Sumantra Bose sa Visoke škole poslovne ekonomije iz Londona. Nastavite dalje pratiti Večernji list i naše emisije. Dovodimo vam nove goste i zanimljive teme. Srdačno i lijepi pozdrav.